Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 27th of June, and in today's update, we're looking at a lot of substantial advances in southern Donetsk in particular. There are also some advances just northeast of Pokrovsk, so that will be what we focus on for the most part in this video, but there are also a couple of changes that occurred around Sumy. So let's begin. And as you guys may know, the map is pretty cluttered with icons. These blue icons indicate geolocations, so that's why I show them on the map when I record the videos, but I'm in the process right now of removing them and archiving them, so it will take a while because there are more than 1,000 of them. So over here you can see that the Russian forces were able to capture the entirety of Shevchenko and in the process took over 7 square kilometers of territory. We have a geolocation backing this up from June 26th. The 57th Motor Rifle Regiment, they were the unit that primarily was involved in the capture of this village. They first were involved in pushing in southwards, so their advance looked something like this. They advanced along the paved road coming out of Burlatska and then made their way into the southern chunk of the village. Then from there, they crossed over the floodplains and in unison with forces that were located basically along this tree line over here, were able to attack into the several other blocks with houses in northern Shevchenko. And although it is one of the larger settlements in this region, even this one isn't that large in terms of surface area or the amount of houses or the amount of basements, and it is relatively isolated from other locations where you have Ukrainian logistics hubs or nodes of defense. Because when you think about it, the connectivity in Shevchenko was really scarce. You have Malivka on the other side of the Donetsk Dnipro border, but even that's a hamlet and it's about 4 kilometers away. Then to the west, you have Komishivacha, and there's no paved road connecting to it, and that's also an isolated hamlet. And then to the north, you have the best lifeline. You have this paved road that connects to Voskresenska, and that's like another 5 kilometers northwards. So all in all, it was extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to continue with their defense over here. And now they're going to shift towards essentially deploying small groups to the trenches that basically circle around Shevchenko, around its perimeter. You can see some of them over here, just a kilometer west of the village, and some that are actually currently under Russian control, which is an issue because the Russians are already beginning to penetrate past Ukraine's line of defenses over here. The Ukrainians built this horizontal line of defense that spans roughly 30 kilometers, I believe, maybe a bit less than that when you measure it, maybe about 25 kilometers. And it basically simmers out when you arrive at the western bank of the Mokryali River. And so the Russians have already been able to penetrate at the Shevchenko location. And by extension, they're going to be able to use that route to advance through the anti-tank ditches and through whatever trenches were dug and take over additional locations and thereby form new salients. You could see how this salient is already beginning to form in the hinterlands between Shevchenko and the western bank of the Mokryali River, where you have Veselay. So just naturally, the Ukrainian squads here are going to get squeezed out because they have no basis for organization. They have nowhere to actually hide from Russian fire, direct fire, and also from FPV crews that are becoming increasingly active over here and that are being positioned on higher vantage points. Whereas the Ukrainians continue getting pushed out of those key high ridge locations into river valleys. And we can see that most notably, the most palpable example would be over here in the Mokryali River Valley, wherein all of the key Ukrainian settlements like Krushivka, Tolstoy, Zerka, Pidubny over here, they're all located on a really low elevation. And to be fair to the Russian side, they also have control over low-lying valleys that obviously are also running along the same river valley. These ones over here like Komar. But the Russians also have the added advantage of now taking over Ukrainian heights to overlook the remaining Ukrainian positions. So whereas this location, the salient over here, has not fallen into Russian hands just yet, you could just see naturally that it's going to eventually fall into their hands just due to the lack of any sort of solid obstacles over here, whether they be settlements or geographic obstacles. So eventually the line is going to correct itself. And then all the high elevated areas that are located in these fields will be utilized by the Russians to give them a proper line of sight to overlook the Ukrainians in their small towns that they still control. That are pretty close to other river valleys like the Vavcha River Valley that is basically acting as the demarcation line between Donetsk and Dnipro. And speaking of that border, now that the Shevchenko village has been captured, the Russians are only 2.3 kilometers away from reaching it at this particular location. And there is another trench line that's basically running along the border over there as well. But to be fair to the Ukrainians, it's not all unfavorable when it comes to local geography. They do have control of some high elevated areas, as you can see over here. But as I continue to reiterate, it's just that they're isolated and not necessarily they can't really be taken advantage of to the same degree because there isn't an area that can be sort of anchored to it to act as a defense node. In the same way that, for instance, like imagine if you had a settlement the size of Ivanivka that was placed in the open field further southwards, then the ridges could actually be taken advantage of to a higher degree. But currently, this area is relatively open, and Russian motorcyclists are taking advantage of that. FPV crews that the Russians have are also utilizing that and having just a very clear view of wherever the Ukrainians are moving through during daylight times and targeting them. And obviously, the same thing works to the Ukrainians' advantage, but we also use that as proof to show when the Russians are able to advance into new locations. So besides Shevchenko, where we have an advance that amounts to what is this, like 2.5 kilometers northwards, you have an advance a bit to the south over here of 0.6 square kilometers, and south of Vilna Pole, an advance of 0.9 square kilometers. Just continue to chip away at the Ukraine forward positions with the eventual goal of getting rid of these forward positions and correcting the front line to this area over here where you do actually have a couple of defensive positions that need to be overran. And then from there, it's basically an open route all the way to the border with over here, it's Zaporozhye and Dnipro. And that gives the Russians the opportunity to actually arrive at this other parts of the trench line that sort of acts as a second layer of defense, hugging the perimeter of the Zaporozhye front line. So that's a part of like the broader strategic vision in this area if we're going to zoom out. But when it comes to individual advances, I may have talked about this already, but in Peribudova, we know that the Russians have been able to capture much of it, not the entirety, due to advances by the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade. So the advance over here does amount to 1.6 kilometers northwards. And notably, the Russians have also been able to capture all of Zaporizhia. So previously, I was cautious of marking it all under Russian control, but now based on this geolocation from June 23rd, we know the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade was able to take advantage of its previously established positions in the east in those basements and launched another attack, presumably with the motorcycles, because I didn't really get a view of any like major participation of armored vehicles. But they were able to push into the rest of the village, take it over, and from there pushed into Yalta, which is also very close to the border. And it's just a natural extension of Zaporizhia when you think about it, because there is a local road connecting them. So the same forces that would have advanced into the center of the town could just, by extension, push into Yalta. And Yalta, again, would be so difficult to defend because of the geography and because it is sort of getting cut off from access via two bodies of water that you can see over here, Vavcha and Mokriali. And the same sort of conundrum can be posed for Zerka over here because it is very small in size. It is relatively close to Yalta. It's about a kilometer and a half away. So there's now a scenario in which you have a two-pronged attack, one coming from the northeast and also one coming from this paved route over here to enter into the village and take it over, and by extension, shave off the entire eastern side of the riverbank over here. And then by extension, all of this other open area, this entire salient would also collapse. And then you would have a correction in the front line. That's the direction that it's going in, basically. At the same time, though, we have advances that are beginning to, ramp up near the Dnipro border, but just south of Udachny. We know the Ukrainians were able to mount a very successful defensive campaign that prevented the full capture of Udachny and sort of left the Russians relegated to the eastern entrance. And really, there were attempts at restarting offensive activities over here, but they were always stymied by the Ukrainian side. And so the Russians shifted focus to an area that lacks the same sort of, I suppose, depth when it comes to like the amount of houses within a settlement, and really started to focus on broader areas where they have more space to attack. So you could see that really with this advance over here that amounted to 2.6 square kilometers of territory captured. And this is just north of Novoserhivka and the Solona River. So the Russian advance over here likely occurred along these local roads that are running along the perimeter of the local pond. And from there, they arrived at this geolocation. It is a pretty deep advance when you look at it. It amounts to about 2 kilometers westwards. And the video here shows that the 55th Artillery Brigade targeted those Russian motorcyclists. They have benefits in the sense that they're able to move in small groups in a highly mobile way. So in a short period of time, they could reach long distances. And they're able to maneuver in ways that, a more bulky armored vehicle cannot do. And so that helps them avoid mines a lot of the time. But the downside is they have no armor protection. So it's rather easy to destroy the motorcycle and by extension, the two or sometimes one soldier that are located sitting on the motorcycle. So in this case, the 55th Brigade, they destroyed two motorcycles. They killed four soldiers that were mounted on them, and then they killed another two that were just walking through fields over here. But what we are now able to ascertain is that the Russians have shifted focus to pushing through this open area. And that's going to lead to higher casualties, but it also means that they're going to be able to push through an area that's less contested before reaching an area that could theoretically be difficult to overrun because of the ridges, because of the ravines that also are stationed over here, and the dug in Ukrainian defensive positions. And also in tandem, you have the Russians pushing into western Novosibirsk, capturing 1.2 square kilometers of territory. This video shows that the 589th Regiment, which is a Russian unit that is attached to the 27th Motor Rifle Division, they were able to raise their flag, and they were targeted during that process by the Black Sky FPV unit. I believe that's the name of the group, and they're part of the 3rd Spartan National Guard Brigade. And that unit is really active right now with trying to put a pause to these Russian advances south of Udachny. So previously, this brigade was heavily involved in defensive operations in Udachny and Kotline, and the sort of urban nature, it's not really urban, but just house fighting is something that they're really experts in doing. So now they also have drone crews that have been attached to them, and they're beginning to sort of expand their efficacy to also begin defensive activities rather in open areas and against fast-paced assaults. But we know that the Russians have been able to advance over here, and their objective now is to essentially reach the demarcation line along the border, cross over Solona, begin to sort of push and find these holes, poke holes in the Ukrainian line, and undermine it to such a degree that eventually they could sort of pave the way for offensive activities onto Novopavlivka and Mezhova. I continue to reiterate that those are sort of the broader plans over here because those are two of Ukraine's forward artillery positions and act as logistics hubs. And then from there, everything gets dispersed to the front line in various locations. Now, looking northeast of Pokrovsk, this is another area where there's been a lot of activity. So we're beginning to see the Russians actually cross over Ukrainian defensive boundaries. So over here, this footage confirms that the Russian forces nearly captured 5 square kilometers of territory. And this is based on geolocations and based on deep state's own reporting. So the Ukrainians, they shelled armored vehicles as they were conducting an armored assault. May have been 2 armored vehicles. And this is an area where the Russians feel more comfortable with these armored assaults because, motorcycles are useful to a certain degree, to a certain amount of distance. But once you reach scales of like 8-10 kilometers between populated areas, it becomes far more risky and much more unlikely for a motorcyclist to actually survive that sort of run. So even though it could be slower, armored assaults are relied upon more heavily for these really daunting tasks, and they're able to absorb much more of the damage as a result. And we could see how that manifested with the capture of additional territory just north of Shevchenko Persha, which is now turning into a forward operating base for Russian forces. And same would go for Kopjeve. And from there, you could see how the salient that's sandwiched in between the prongs could naturally be caved in on and squeezed out. And then from there, you could see the Russians go for Novoturatsk, Boykivka. That's the general direction of this northwestward advance. That's certainly a possibility. And again, we can't ignore the broader objective over here of reaching this paved road over here. This paved road then gives them access to the rail line that directly connects to Pokrovsk. And then from there, you have the highway that connects between Dobropilia and Pokrovsk. And that's the overarching goal. And again, we're looking at really wide distances. So this is not something that's short term. And I will continue reiterating that. But it's a part of just over the course of the latter portion of this year, tightening the noose on Pokrovsk. And not just that, but also creating new opportunities to exploit, large holes in the Ukrainian line. Because you see over here, there is this massive ridge that, yeah, it is on high elevation, so that's going to be beneficial to the Ukrainians, but it's also just completely open and going to be difficult to defend because there aren't many fortifications over here besides the villages themselves, like Poltavka and Rusin Yar. So there is a large area that could be exploited over here that I haven't seen mentioned much, and we're looking at the second portion of this year, the second half, and the potential for Konstantinivka to really fall victim to Russian attacks. And there is a potential that the Russians try to exploit this western gap over here, this western flank, try to take it over to give them, favorable maneuvering positions, but also the higher elevation needed to target and fully dismember the forward positions of the Ukrainians in these various locations, whether they be the line that is basically the Turets River line, as I would refer to it, running along Konstantinivka and then running along the border to Druskivka. Or it could be this paved road that branches out of Druskivka and runs through smaller settlements like Shehove and Volodymyrivka. But that's another line that's very important to the Ukrainians that could potentially be exposed in case the wedge in between them falls into Russian hands. And it's becoming more and more likely that the sort of defense mechanisms around this sort of open ridge become more and more exposed. So that's an issue that the Ukrainian higher command has to address. And I haven't seen it mentioned yet. Over here, looking at the more granular details, the Russian forces captured a small plot of land north of the T-0504 highway on the Yablonivka front. There's a video here from the 4th Guard Battalion of the 101st Guard Brigade. They conducted FAV strikes onto motorcycles as they were trying to sort of seep into the trench line over here. So that's another objective that the Russians currently have with this Yablonivka front. Not just to take over the populated areas themselves, but also the adjacent trenches, areas that they're very formidable, difficult to overrun because, you don't have a large concentration of Ukrainian forces, but the ones that are over here are situated in really effective areas. These trenches were very well built, multiple layers, also minefields, dugouts, zigzags, underground portions, bunkers, everything that would be needed for this. And a lot of the time, you also have barbed wire that's sort of located at the beginning of these defensive structures. So there are a lot of components to it over here, and that's in stark contrast to the defenses that we don't see much of in the Sumy region. When you look over here at Turets, and we're beginning to see a lot of movements that could shape the future of the attacks over here. So first of all, some of these salients are beginning to just cave in on themselves due to fatigue and an inability to access resources from far away. So over here, the Russians captured nearly 6 square kilometers of territory in between Leonidivka and Romanivka. In terms of an advance from south to north, it amounts to 1.6 kilometers, so it is a substantial advance. And then over here, you have Novospassky and Trochanbenivka, two really important nodes, forward clusters of defense for the Ukrainian side that also acts as an area for projection. First of all, it denies the Russians the opportunity to use Leonidivka to advance northwards along the Kryvyi River. So that's really beneficial to the Ukrainians over here. And furthermore, it gets used as an outlet to connect to the forward Ukrainian positions that continue to be a thorn in the Russians' backside in Zabalka. So continuously, even though Turets has largely fallen into Russian hands, this is used as a forward base, as a linchpin to renew attacks every couple of weeks, and that prevents the sort of situation from turning much worse. The Russians continue focusing on the same general locations instead of looking ahead to their next target. So they get bogged down as a result, and the manpower needed for this isn't necessarily that high. But that's why the Russians are exploiting the flanks that aren't that well defended, and they're attacking from the north. So you have over here the capture of 2.4 square kilometers of territory, and a video from the Ukrainian side from June 17th. So it is a bit old, but I just found it now, of Russian infantry that were shelled in houses north of Novospassky. So this gives us an indication that they were able to cross over the main road over here in the rail line and got themselves into an area that includes houses and basements. Now the objective has to be to solidify this part of the front line because the Ukrainians do still have a counterattacking capability over here. And from there to squeeze the Ukrainians out of these two settlements for good, because that would deny the Ukrainians, frankly, a large chunk of territory that they currently have. And it's not just about the square kilometers or the surface area, but about the sort of purpose that it serves in delaying future Russian advances, as you can see over here. It's an area that amounts to just 5.5 square kilometers, but it is very important. And its fall would then give the Russians the opportunity to focus all of their efforts, and primarily from the 103rd Motor Rifle Regiment, on other villages further upstream of this river, like Katerinivka, Klebanbek. And as we all know, the final objective would be to arrive at the southeastern outskirts of Konstantinivka. Now, looking at the Chasiv Yar front, we have an entrance into the Shevchenko microdistrict. The Russians over here continue making slow inroads. Again, the Ukrainian garrison over here, despite the uncertainty associated with the geography and the terrain, they have been able to bog down the Russians. And it's not even in the urban areas, it's in the rural areas and in the forested patches where they're doing this. So over here, we have a video from June 24th of the Ares unit in the 24th Mechanized Brigade, and they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian forces in the Shevchenko microdistrict. And we know that as a result, about 20 hectares of territory were captured by the Russian side. So there is still a lot of work to do from a Russian perspective over here to take over the rest of the microdistrict, which you can see over here in this red perimeter, and then also to take over a lot of other loosely defined connected areas like Mykolaiivka, Chervone, Podilske. So, the Russian airborne units over here, they do have a lot of work in that regard. And there are a lot of salients that the Ukrainians continue to rely upon, like the one into the citadel in Chasiv Yar, or this one over here that's just to the east of Supochki. And it's all a part of the process of dragging out time to allow the Ukrainians that are defending in Konstantinivka to build up their defenses around the outer perimeter of the city, because I don't think it's sufficient right now. I certainly don't think that it's sufficient along this southeastern stretch, really. But about a bit to the north, around the northeastern stretch, it's a bit more manageable. So there certainly has to be a lot of work done by the Ukrainian sappers, by the engineering forces to continue building up the perimeter of this city. And as I continue to reiterate, there has to be a level of foresight, not to just defend in a sort of meniscus shape and a semicircle shape over here. There also has to be work done on the rear because there could be an attack coming in from that open area that I discussed previously. So, that's just a general assessment of Konstantinivka. And to finish off, I want to talk about the front line west of the Oskil River and also Sumy. So let's zoom in over here on the events unfolding near Kirushivka, because this is a really interesting advance. The Russians captured nearly 7 square kilometers of territory, and that includes the full capture of the hamlet Kalinove. It also includes the capture of Holubivka, and then this local facility. I'm not sure what it exactly is, but from there you have a paved route. So it's an agricultural area, and then from there you have a route that connects to another hamlet, that being Radkivka over here. Radkivka is so important because it gives the Russians access to the highway from another location that's far closer to Kupiansk. Radkivka is actually the final populated area that the Russians would have to capture before arriving at the gates of Kupiansk from the northwest. So taking it over, and it's a small area, small surface area. So unless there's a monumental Ukrainian counterattack, it is certainly feasible. That would give them the opportunity to then run along the R79 and attack Kupiansk from the rear. Because just imagine, all this time over the past year, 2 years, all the focus has gone into defending the northeastern approaches, and in that regard, they've been very successful. There was one incident where the Russians infiltrated very deep into Kupiansk, into this industrial area, into the armory, but then they were repelled over a couple of weeks. So the line is pretty solid over here. But to the northwest, the same situation isn't really that clear yet, because we can see that there are a lot of deep Russian penetrations that have not been dealt with sufficiently by the Ukrainian side. And as a result, we have a capture of, 3.5 kilometers moving southwards, and salient that has been formed, that is sandwiched in between Kirushivka and Radkivka. You can see it over here. And then from there, they advance southwards and are able to enter into the western approaches of Kupiansk. That would be the vision from a Russian perspective. And it's not just about that. It's also about sort of denying the Russians access, or rather the Ukrainians, access to the roads needed to connect with Kupiansk on either side of the river, for that matter. But when you look at it, there aren't that many bridges that are connecting to the eastern bank of the river. And so really getting fire control, or consistently dealing blows to the logistics routes that are connecting to western Kupiansk and then cross over the river, would play a role in degrading Ukraine's capabilities on the other side of the Oskil over a prolonged period of time. So certainly something to think about as we move forward. And I think there's one other advance over here. You could see that nearly 1 square kilometer of territory was captured just to the southeast of Dovhenke. It's just another forested patch, and you can see that the Vidmak grenade unit, I believe it's called, is a Vidmak drone unit. They drop grenades onto forested patches, and the Russians are looking at continuing to exploit their advances along this particular highway in order to then create salients that are sandwiched in between those, deeper penetrations. So you can see examples of that already forming over here and over here in between the line of contact in Fikholivka, that being one of Russia's local objectives. Now, to finish off with Sumy, I want to show you guys the situation over here. There is a slight Ukrainian counterattack and also a slight Russian advance. So previously, the Russians had captured all of Andrivka, and that was important because it then gave them essentially complete access to the next line of Ukrainian defense, which would amount to Khotin, Pisarivka, and Mala Korchkivka, sorry. So you could see that over here, the Ukrainians were able to retake 4.5 square kilometers of territory. They understood that the situation was untenable because eventually the Russians would be able to regroup and launch their new wave of assaults, essentially moving southwards 5 kilometers, and they would be able to assault the next round of Ukrainian defenses. So instead of shifting the fight southwards closer to the city of Sumy, they're trying to opt for an active defense and trying to bog down the fighting in areas that had already been fought over, that already had been taken over by the Russians. So that's what's being attempted now in Andrivka, and the Ukrainians certainly have the manpower needed to do this. They also have the know-how on how to conduct these counterattacks because the Ukrainian units that are involved in defense right now, a lot of them were involved in the initial opening salvo of the Kursk offensive, and other ones were involved in smaller attacks that occurred, positional counterattacks in Kursk or also in Belgorod. So they have the ability to try to pull it off, but now it's just a question of how long they can hold on to the southern tip before the gains are reversed, and then the Russians have the ability to advance along this highway, this route over here along tree lines, and then this highway, and then they would be able to arrive at the next line of Ukrainian defenses, which is certainly a concern for the Ukrainians because these areas are not well kept when it comes to the trenches. There aren't that many defenses over here. We're also seeing the Russians begin to focus on stabilizing the front line, creating a correction because in Novomykolaivka and Verashny, we still have Ukrainian resistance, and I believe that's totally understandable because as long as they're able to afford this, it does prevent cohesion between the Russian garrisons that are located over here and to a larger degree near Yunikivka. So having that wedge in between certainly does affect logistics, and it also gives a forward firing points. It also prevents deeper advances along this line to arrive at, Krapishina or Novosich or Kyantia. The list goes on. But now the Russians are beginning to attack over here and captured nearly 1 square kilometer of territory. This video is from the 420th Unmanned Strike Battalion. They conducted grenade drops onto those Russian soldiers as they were pushing further eastwards. And that's all after today. I will continue updating the map in the sense that I'm going to remove all these icons, but it takes so long because I do this once a year once I'm done with all my exams. That's when I have time to do it because you have to literally sit down for 12 hours and manually move all the icons to a single category and then archive it and create a new map. So I'm going to do that, but it's going to take a while. I've already started. I'm probably 20% of the way done. So I appreciate the understanding, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.